Welcome to my presentation video on photography, the telegraph of art. Photography alters our perception of what is happening in society, and the invention of photography allows us to communicate with more emotional impact by using visual representation. The process of photography is highly related to the technological shift in media and communications in the U.S. during the electronic revolution from the mid-19th century until the mid-20th century. Photography is typically thought of as part of art history rather than media history, but photography shares common social, political, and economic contexts with early electronic media evolution in several interesting ways. The revolution of communication technology at the turn of the 20th century was significant. Electrical developments led to a slew of inventions in a short period of time, including the telegraph, telephone, radio, and television. In addition, the development of the railroads and postal services throughout the U.S., while significant on their own, were used in tandem with photography for cultural influence and change. Specifically, photography is tied to the telegraph, the expansion of the railroad and the postal exchange, and the way people use these three developments in conjunction with photography directed how the technology further developed. Telegraphy and photography. Let's first look at the naming of both inventions. Both contain graph, which, as a suffix, comes from the Greek word graphos, meaning written or writing. So telegraph and photograph are both named as something that writes, prefixed with the instrument used. Telegraphy is an electrical process that allows people to write a message and send it to another location called a telegraph. Photography is a chemical process that allows people to write a visual message and save it onto a physical object called a photograph. The connection between photography and the telegraph was made early in their use. In 1851, Edward Hitchcock, a professor of geology and natural theology at Amherst College, saw them both as evidence of the telegraph system of the universe, as he describes in a poetic form. Into a vast sounding gallery, into a vast picture gallery, and into a universal telegraph. The principle anticipates future technology and aims at harnessing the power of electricity to send images of letters and pictures through wires from one place to another. In the essay Ways of Seeing, William Urchero argues that photographic technologies, combined with other media communication technologies like the telephone, virtually extend human perceptions to events and locations beyond their physical and temporal bounds. Photography was developed commercially in the late 1830s by a few inventors, notably Samuel Morse. Also in the late 1830s, photography was developed into a commercial process by Louis Daguerre. In March of 1839, Morse traveled to Paris in order to obtain a patent on his telegraph, which was when he met Louis Daguerre and learned of his daguerreotype process. Morse, who was also a successful painter, was intrigued by Daguerre's process of painting with light, calling it Rembrandt perfected. Morse met with Daguerre twice while visiting Paris, eventually learning the process from him, and later went on to become one of the first photographers in America, bringing the daguerreotype to America and teaching the technique to others in the studio he opened up in New York. After opening his photography studio, Morse trained some of the most well-known and influential photographers of the time, notably Matthew Brady. Now we'll talk about Matthew Brady and how his photography communicated a major event a little more later on. The railroad and photography. As the process of photography rapidly developed, photographers were commissioned by the government to take pictures of the beauty of the West to get Western migration and to lure the public to use the train for sightseeing. This was an attempt to expand the railroad and build the nation. The attempts were successful and resulted in increased demand to see such beauty. People loved to see the landscapes of the West. In fact, the demand for landscape photography became so great that publishing companies started to form just to build a collection of stock images of landscapes and landmarks to create a mass production of stereographs, a panoramic-type viewing device. But this wasn't the only connection between photography and the railroad. Photography and the railroad as technologies were advancing side by side with an incredible influence reinforcing each other as they were both considered the technologies that were conquering the western frontier. In 1866, Philadelphia photographer claimed that the telegraph was the railway of art because it was able to carry us to points afar. The Postal Service and photography. The postal exchange of information was also largely connected to photography. It was at the early height of photography that the postal exchange started to become more widely used. Postage was very cheap at the time, and the small physical size of the daguerreotype made it easy to share through the mail. When the daguerreotype trading started, it was like a game. The technology advanced where exposure time decreased enough that images of people, rather than just landscapes, were possible. People loved to collect pictures, even of people they didn't know. Photographs became as frequent in the mail as money, especially during the Civil War and the California Gold Rush, when many Americans were away and portraits were sent home, making family members feel close to their loved ones that were far away. And the realism of photography did that. Photography was used to document the Civil War, allowing war to be seen by the general public. Prior to the Civil War, artists would paint interpretations of the battlefield, but with photography, images of war were seen with realistic accuracy. During Victorian Europe, war was seen as romantic and brave, which still carried relatively true in America before photographs of the Civil War emerged and documented the realism of it. The Civil War was often considered the first modern war, as so many technologies were developing concurrently. Different commands stationed apart could communicate by telegraph. War reports could be telegraphed home and sent to newspapers, who could now print faster and more efficiently with the invention of the rotary press and steam engine. The railroad also helped deliver communications faster throughout the country. The combination of these technologies brought the news to the public faster than ever before, and with photography, the strength of a visual connection heightened whatever message was being received. The civilians were drawn into the war through the media with their ability to produce stories faster than ever. But newspapers couldn't produce photographs yet, so photographers would put up gallery exhibitions to showcase the public's desire for realism of what was happening. People were emotionally invested with the constant coverage, and images created with photography opened their eyes to something new. Matthew Brady, who we mentioned earlier as a student of Samuel Morse, became famously known as a Civil War photographer. Front-line images of the Civil War were shared with the public through Brady. This was something that normally only soldiers would have been able to visualize, and these images impacted people and shaped their opinions. Photographs in Brady's New York City gallery resonated with the public more than a list of names and details in a newspaper. The images were emotionally disturbing to the people who could only fantasize about it before. As photographic technology continued to advance to the point that photographs could be made by a regular person and not just photographers, the photography industry exploded. Cameras were expensive and complicated, and one company changed that. Kodak. Kodak Eastman played off the increased demand for photography and developed flexible film, which allowed them to create a camera that was targeted to the general public instead of photographers. Kodak used the public's desire for photography and focused its marketing on ease of use. Information could now be shared among everyday people. Government regulation dictated what was shared over radio and TV technologies, but not photography. People could photograph and share their images with unregulated distribution, private or publicly. The height of photography use amongst the general public was synergistic with the new forms of sharing information, such as the expansion of the railroad, the postal service, and early radio and television. Eventually, as newspapers and magazines were able to print photography with their stories, the media mimicked the effect of Matthew Brady's Civil War images in print media to create a more powerful influence on issues. Advertising also became more influential with photography. Magazines and newspapers started to use photographs as the primary source of information to impact their audience, rather than supplemental to the text. Arguably, the invention of the telegraph, telephone, radio, and television, coupled with the Western expanding railroad and postal exchange, resulted in a massive cultural revolution for society. But before we communicated with moving pictures on a screen in people's homes, or electricity through wires, we used light to put images on various static mediums for visual representation. The technology for capturing and saving images grew over time, and as it became better and more affordable, photography became more widely used as a visual communications method. The invention of photography and other emerging technologies used during the electronics era allowed people to see visually what was happening at other places in the world. Similar to how the telegraph printed a message on paper using electricity, photography took a visual message and transferred it to a physical medium using light. What was seen by someone in one place could be transformed into a tangible form and seen by someone else somewhere else. And the invention of the telegraph, the expansion of the railroad, and the postal exchange helped it do just that. My research on this topic convinces me that photography should be included as a medium of information technology alongside technologies such as the postal exchange and a railroad that are complementary to the telegraph, telephone, radio, and television. Often the overlap seems to have gone unnoticed. Neither art history nor media history seems to cover this overlap. But as a student in both areas, the correlation was immediate to me and left me wondering the extent of the technology's complementary nature towards each other. For more information on this topic, I have a list of sources here. I specifically recommend starting with the article by Simone Natalie titled Photography and Communication Media in the 19th Century.